And it'll be coming from Zoom webinars. So just be on the lookout for that. You just need to send a name and an email. So I think we're going to get started at 6 o'clock. So welcome everybody. My name is Hallie Rosen, and I'm the program director here at the Chicago Architecture Center. Tonight is our last evening of virtual OHC programs since the end of OHC weekend, October 16th and 17th. 15th and 16th. We've had 4 virtual programs. This is the last one. And we really have appreciated the opportunity to showcase some of our community partners. And these programs also allow us to learn a little more about the neighborhoods that are highlighted as part of Open House Chicago. And I do want to mention that we appreciate the support of our presenting sponsor for Open House Chicago, Wintrust Bank. So just want to let you know, today might not be the day to take a walking tour or a river cruise. So we understand if today wasn't your day, but do keep in mind that the center is open, still open 7 days a week, 10 to 5 p.m. Got 3 more weeks, about 4 more weeks of the river cruise. Our walking tours are still available. Our neighborhood tours will be ending this month. This is the perfect time to be taking a cemetery tour. And then, of course, if you come to the center, we have some exhibits. And you might see a little dust because we're getting ready for our newest exhibit, which will open November 17th. I'm being not forthcoming in what the name of the exhibit is, so it's a little bit of a surprise. But we're so glad that you're all here tonight. And whether you're doing a walking tour, attending a program, visiting the center, I want to remind you that the Chicago Architecture Center commits to sharing honest and empathetic stories of Chicago, its design over time, and the diverse people who have imprinted the city with a unique sense of place. Our responsibility includes spotlighting the region's earliest residents, many whose descendants still proudly call Chicago home. This ongoing commitment to champion our Indigenous friends, neighbors, and kin is essential to our work toward building a better Chicago. Couple of housekeeping notes for everyone. Just a reminder, you're all muted. We can't see your faces. If you have any tech issues, put them in the chat. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. And we will be sending a recording to everyone who registered for the program 2 business days from today. So many of you know that in 2022, it was the 200th anniversary of the birth of Frederick Law Olmsted. And this is the 3rd program that we have done over the year to mark this milestone for the founder of America's landscape architecture. I was looking back in my notes, and the first program we did actually was during Open House Chicago 2021. Julia was our speaker then. And of course, we are highlighting Jackson Park and Washington Park, which are the 2 Chicago parks designed by Olmsted. We have several sponsors for tonight's program: the Hyde Park Historical Society, which was founded in 1975 to record, preserve, and promote the public interest in the history of Hyde Park. It's worth a visit to their headquarters, which is located in restored Cable's car station. The program is also sponsored by the Washington Park Camera Club, which you will learn more about later. It is the oldest African-American camera club. And then finally, tonight's program is presented as part of Art Design Chicago Now, an initiative funded by the Terra Foundation for American Art that amplifies the voices of Chicago's diverse creatives, past and present, and explores the essential role they play in shaping the now. So as I mentioned earlier, we have 3 speakers for our past, present, and future. After each speaker does their presentation, we'll break. So if you have any questions specific to what that speaker just said, pop them in the Q&A, and we will take a quick break in between each speaker so you can ask your questions. And then all 3 of the speakers will join me and we'll have a conversation, and we should be finished at about 7:15. So let's get on to our first speaker, who is Julia Bachrach. I already mentioned she's no stranger to the CAC, Open House Chicago, or Chicago. She's been a frequent speaker and instructor at the CAC and other cultural institutions. She served as the Chicago's Park District's historian and planning supervisor for more than 2 decades. She's now a consultant and avid blogger. She researches local architecture and design landscapes, compiles historic surveys, works on landmark nominations, documents, and cultural resources. So Julia, why don't you join us and pull up your screen?
Thank you. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, we can. You just have to
All
put
right.
it,
Yeah.
start it from the beginning.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Hallie.
Okay.
I'm very, very excited about this program tonight. And so I am covering a very big topic in a very small amount of time. So I hope I can do it justice. I have 10 minutes to give us the Olmsted legacy in Chicago. Frederick Law Olmsted was America's preeminent landscape architect. He gave us such amazing, incredible places as Central Park in New York, the Boston Emerald Necklace, the National Capitol Grounds, and Stanford University campus. Altogether, his firm produced more than 5,000 projects. Their work in Chicago is very significant, but it's often kind of overlooked. So I am going to try to share it with you tonight. The story of Olmsted in Chicago really begins with the approval of the South Park Act in 1869. In the 1860s, there were citizens in Chicago who were rallying for a whole system of parks. They really wanted an ambitious system of interconnected parks and boulevards, and they were helping each other on legislation to make that possible. And so finally in 1869, 3 separate acts of state legislation were approved. And there had been talk about bringing Olmsted to design all 3 park systems, the Lincoln Park Commission at the north, the West Park Commission, which was kind of on the left side of the left map, which is Humboldt, Garfield, and Douglas Parks, and the South Park Commission on the bottom. But only the South Park Commission could afford to hire him. In addition to the fact that there were some wealthy Chicagoans who were starting to settle on the South Side, they had the loop within their taxing jurisdiction. When they brought Olmsted to the site in Chicago to see this 1,055-acre site that they would transform into parkland, you know, he was known for kind of seeing the genius of the place, seeing the best features of every site. But when he looked at our landscape in Chicago, did he say, ah, what a beautiful place for a park? Not exactly. He said, if a search had been made for the least park-like grounds within miles of the city, nothing better meeting that requirement could have been found. He was not a big fan of our Midwestern landscape. He did, however, think it had one redeeming feature, and I'm sure everybody can guess what that was. Lake Michigan. He said the lake could be made by artificial means no more grand or sublime. And so Lake Michigan kind of provided the guiding theme for his original plan of 1871 that he produced with his then partner Calvert Box. And his idea was that you'd enter the park by boat into what was called the Eastern Division, which later became known as Jackson Park, and you'd navigate through this very rugged series of lushly planted waterways with lots of islands and big peninsula. And then you would go down this formal canal in the kind of middle there along what he called the Midway Plaisance into Little Small Lake in the Western Division, which became West Washington Park. And just above, you see there's kind of this big green swath, and that was the sheep meadow. In addition to the fact that sheep would graze there freely, a shepherd would round them up in the evening. There were lots of different games that were played on the meadow. Olmsted believed that that the parks were the great democratic experiment of America. This was the one place in Victorian society where people of all different backgrounds and cultures and classes would have a chance to mingle. And you'll hear pretty soon from Duane, who grew up around the park, and I'm sure we'll talk more about what it was like to have that as your neighborhood park. The Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted came back to Chicago after Chicago was selected in 1890 for the site of the world's Columbian Exposition. A group of prominent Southsiders had gone to the Paris Exposition in 1889, and they were determined that Chicago would win the honor of hosting the next World's Fair. And of course, the people in New York were not real happy when the United States Congress did pick Chicago as the host of the fair. So Olmsted, with his then young partner, Henry Sargent Codman, was asked to come back to Chicago in the kind of late spring and summer of 1890 to help select a site for the World's Fair. The original park plan had only been partially implemented, as you can see here on the right. And so he did a study of 7 different sites and recommended Jackson Park as the site for the fair, which one of its kind of most important aspects was the fact that it had the Lake Michigan as its backdrop. And so Olmsted and Codman worked very closely with Chicago architects Daniel Burnham and John Wellborn Root to lay out the fairgrounds. And of course, they were very influenced by the original plan. They determined that there should be a great architectural court with a body of water therein. There should be a formal canal leading northward from this court to a series of broader waterings of lagoon character, so that the principal exposition buildings would each have a water as well as land frontage and would be approachable by boats. And so in this colored version of the plan for the fairgrounds, that I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that sort of T-shaped area or L shape on the bottom was the court of honor. And then if you kind of move your eye up along the blue water system, you can see that that peninsula had been carved into a wooded island. So here was what the court of honor looked like, with the great white Beaux-Arts buildings surrounding it. And of course, you'd have your back to Lake Michigan to take this photograph. And then here was the wooded island. Olmsted felt very committed to keeping the wooded island free of buildings or other obstructions. He felt it should be very natural, but he wrote, after a time, demands came for the use of the islands for a variety of purposes, and at length we became convinced that it would be impossible to successfully resist these demands. When we reluctantly reached this conclusion, we had to determine which of all these propositions urged, if adopted, would have the least obtrusive and disquieting result. And so he decided, with a lot of coaxing from Burnham, that they should accept the proposal from the Japanese government to create the Ho'oden, the Phoenix Pavilion, the Japanese government's pavilion on the wooded island, because it would have the elegance and simplicity that was befitting this vision that he had. Olmsted came back to Chicago in 1894 to transform the site back the fairgrounds back into usable parkland. By that point, his firm was called Olmsted and Elliott, and both of his sons were involved. One of the first things that he was assigned to do, that they were assigned to do, is to transform the Midway into usable park space. And so the Midway had been the site of the Ferris wheel and other rides, and also these very strange foreign exhibits that are not very tasteful at all by today's standards, not really acceptable for what we consider it today. But in kind of by that point, the University of Chicago was starting to kind of rise up along the north side of the Midway. And so Olmsted used this as an opportunity to convince the park commissioners, let's get the canal down the Midway. And they were a little apprehensive, but he did convince them, and they voted in favor of having the canal. And in fact, as you can see from this Chicago Tribune article, they started to excavate this in the summer of 1894, actually started having laborers dig the first 3 feet of the trench that they then expected to come back the next summer to complete. They did end up abandoning the project, but as you'll be learning more from Patricia O'Donnell soon, the plan that they did to transform the rest of Jackson Park into usable fairgrounds really was quite well implemented. And so here's a Chicago Tribune rendering of the Olmsted and Elliott plan. And here's an aerial that doesn't quite come back far enough of Jackson Park today. in 1901, the Olmsted brothers came back to Chicago because the University of Chicago asked them to. The University of Chicago was having a big conundrum. They had this wonderful plan, the original plan for Gothic buildings and formal quads by Henry Ives Cobb. But then the trustees decided to hire a naturalistic landscape architect, O.C. Simons, to create a plan that a lot of the trustees and professors thought really didn't kind of pay any respect to the original Cobb plan. They thought the Simons path system was bizarre, and they weren't so happy with these kind of naturalistic groupings of shrubs. So they asked the Olmsteds to come to Chicago to advise Simons for what he should do to make it better. In the end, they fired Simons, hired the Olmsted brothers, and the Olmsted brothers created this formal plan with, very kind of simple alleys of elm trees that were quite respectful of the idea of the quadrans. And then the Olmsted brothers came back again in 1903, and this was because the South Park Commission had asked them to come and help design a system that was considered revolutionary, a system of new parks that would be introduced throughout the densely populated areas of their jurisdiction where lots of immigrants had settled and they didn't have proper services or adequate open space. And so the Olmsted brothers worked with D.H. Burnham and Company. The Burnhams designed a new type of building, the field house, and the Olmsted brothers created plans for parks that ranged in size from 7 acres to as much as 300 acres in size, trying to weave in many of the beautiful elements, the winding paths, the tree groves, the meadows that their father had loved, but also include this whole laundry list of elements that J. Frank Foster of the South Park Commission had suggested. The parks, the first 10 were built in 1 year in 1905. They included public bathing facilities, outdoor wading pools, swimming pools, running tracks, playgrounds, and then the brand new type of building, the field house with branches of the Chicago Public Library, and they had like vocational training, and doctors and nurses would come and do immunizations, and basically you could get all of your needs met by these parks except for housing. And President Teddy Roosevelt, kind of recognizing the significance of this revolutionary new park system, asked people, there was going to be a big parks conference in Chicago in 1907, asked municipalities to send representatives to see these parks, which he described as one of the most notable civic achievements in any American city. The park commissioners worked closely with social reformers, and they were really into collecting data. So as you can see from these statistics, they were keeping track of how many people used those 10 parks the first year. And of course, altogether more than the parks had more than 5 million visits. The Olmsteds and Burnham believed this was a very important kind of model that would be important to the rest of the country. And so the Olmsted brothers spoke about it at conferences, began designing neighborhood parks in other parts of the country. And D.H. Burnham and Company did a whole chapter about parks and really closely described these parks in the 1909 plan of Chicago. And the Chicago model then really influenced the development of parks throughout America. Thank you.
All righty, thank you, Julia. I just asked anyone again if there's any questions. I had one, so of course I'll take the prerogative as the moderator. Field houses, was that something that then started in Chicago and then can be found in parks all over America?
Yes,
United
right.
States?
Exactly. That whole model, both the architecture and the landscape architecture, it was it was a cohesive idea. And so field houses were part of it. And, parks had buildings before that, but they tended to have an individual, a singular focus. And many times the park buildings were only open in the summer. So that was a very influential part of the idea.
Very interesting. Yeah, I never really how important, they were a real social service beyond being a space to have fresh air. So a couple questions are popping up. How many of those parks, those early parks prior to 1909 still exist?
Oh, that's a really great question. It's funny, I tried to count before I began, but here's the thing. So a number of them are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Of course, Jackson Park, Washington Park, and the Midway are all listed on the National Register. The U of C is part of the National Register listing for Hyde Park, and there's a Park and Boulevards nomination. But the other ones, it's a little hard to count because sometimes there's still a park, but you can't recognize the building, or you can recognize the building, but you can't recognize the landscape. So out of those first 10, and then, well, the first 14 we'll say, because there were 4 held back, and then I think either 6 or 7 of those are now on the National Register. I would say there's a couple more that would be eligible for listing. So I would just average it out as maybe about 10 of those Olmsted landscapes still exist in various shapes of integrity, some better than others.
Okay. And then Julie's wondering, where were the Burnhams from? Because you mentioned they came back to Chicago.
The Burnhams came back to Chicago. I wonder what I said. Well, Burnham was originally from New York. His family was from the East Coast, but I'm not sure what I was. Oh no, the Olmsteds were coming back to Chicago.
Oh.
That's what it was. I'm sorry,
Okay.
I was confused for a moment. So the Olmsted, so Frederick Law Olmsted was first from New York, and then he moved to Brookline, Massachusetts. And I have to tell you that the Olmsted home and studio is a National Historic Site in Brookline called Fairstead, and it's well worth a visit. And I guess I also, while I'm talking about archives, want to plug the fact that you saw I had lots of beautiful plans and drawings, and most, but not all of those are from the Chicago Park District archives, which are now in the special collections of Harold Washington Library.
And you had an exhibit of that last year.
Right, exactly. And the National Park Service has also digitized the Olmsted papers and the Olmsted drawings. And so a lot of these materials are either available digitally online, or you can just go over to special collections. You don't even need to make an appointment, just check their hours.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, then we're going to move on to our next speaker. So was the Midway Canal abandoned for financial reasons or for some other reason?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think the simplest answer is yes, financial reasons. But I think one of the issues was that and I've never really been able to fully document this, but I've always heard this and it sounds right to me. The land at Washington Park was a little bit higher and Jackson Park was a little bit lower. And the commissioners were worried the water would just drain down the canal and back into the lake. And the Olmsted said, no, we'll build locks and it'll be fine. But they never really got the opportunity.
One other question here, would flow, I'm guessing FLO, which I'm not, oh,
That's
Frederick Law
Frederick.
Olmsted, I forgot.
FLO,
So
yeah.
I'm not in the, I know Frank Lloyd Wright, but anyway,
Yeah,
FLW, I
know what FLO is.
Okay, would
Yeah.
FLO have approved of all the elements in parks designed by Olmsted Brothers Parks?
Oh, that is such a great question. I really love that. And it would be interesting to hear at the end what Patricia has to say about that. I would say that he would think, I always hate to conjecture what people would think, but I would say that he would think, or that many people would think, that when the parks were larger, like Sherman Park or Marquette Park, it could be done more successfully. The smaller squares like Cornell Square or Davis Square were often criticized for having too much gravel and not enough green. I'm not sure if the Olmsted brothers themselves ever dissed their own work like that, but certainly it was much more difficult when you were trying to compact a whole bunch of facilities in a small area.
Okay, great. Alrighty, we're going to move to the present. So thank you for that. And I see some of those questions. We'll answer those later, or Julie, if you want to type an answer, you can while you're watching. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's Duane Savage. And let me tell you a little bit about Duane. He's a photographer and past president of the Washington Park Camera Club, which is the oldest predominantly African-American camera club in the Chicagoland. In honor of Olmsted's birthday, the club produced South Park Then and Now, an online photographic essay that weaves together historic and contemporary images. And you'll see in the chat a link to this that you can look at on YouTube. And the project was especially meaningful to Duane because Washington Park has been his stomping grounds for much of his life. So there, welcome, Duane. And if you want to pull up your screen, share your files.
Hello, everyone. I think we're right.
You are. It looks good.
Okay, let me hold on a second. I don't see my controls here. No, move forward. Let me try again.
Okay.
I'll try this one.
Sometimes if you go on the bottom left in the dark black part, you can find the arrow and it'll let you
I
go.
see it, yeah. Okay. So it
We
seems
have
I can do it that way. I was able to, yeah, I got it now.
Okay.
Thank you for having me. I'm not a historian. I'm here to learn. I have learned quite a bit from the Chicago Architectural Center, and especially from Julia. I've attended some of her walks in the park, and she's very informative. So I'll give you a little bit of my background. I fell in love with the park when our family moved there in 1960. I was 5 years old and lived on 59th and Calumet, which is, if I left out the alley, I was less than a half a block away from the park. And the park looked so immense, expansive to me as a child. It took me a good 10 years just to have said I've been through all of the parts of the park. But it was literally like our backyard. And I didn't realize how fortunate I was as a child until I saw some other people that lived and grew up in places where there were no large green spaces at all. And they were cramming themselves in the corner lots and things like that, playing strikeouts in the alleys. So I was very fortunate that we were able to grow up in this area. And I'll tell you my impressions of how the park is important to me. Let's get started here. These are some of the photos from our exhibit that Washington Park Camera Club put together, the Then and Now exhibit. This shows the DuSable Museum, which it was a Burnham design building. It had a fanciful garden in front, as you can see in the old picture, and again in the new. They did keep a lot of those features. Margaret Burroughs established the African American History Museum in 1961, and later in the 70s, they gave her this building, gave the African American Museum of History this building for a museum, and it's been used like that ever since. It's really a great place to visit if you ever get a chance to come in Chicago if you're not here. Here's another view of the same building. At one time, this building, when I was growing up in the 60s, it was actually a Park District police station. And I remember it because we knew the building was there. And I got a pair of walkie-talkies for Christmas. That was really huge back then. Just after transistor radios came out, they came out with little small walkie-talkies for kids. And in the kit, it had this FCC, Federal Communication Commission, warning about how you can't use this thing in certain places. And so we walked over there with our walkie-talkies and walked up to the desk and asked the sergeant, is it okay if we use these walkie-talkies? After he had a giggle, he said, no, it's no problem at all. You're not going to interfere with any of the work that we're doing. So that place has meaning for me in other ways as well. Here's a picture of the Fountain of Time. It was done by Laredo Taft. At the time, it was considered a masterpiece. It is a very large statue of Fountain by any standards. It's got to be a quarter of a block long. And it shows the struggles of mankind throughout history. You can sort of walk across it and see all of the images through time as they struggle to move forward. A lot of anguish is shown in this. We thought it was a great climbing feature. So we would walk over there about the time, which was a good 3.5 blocks away, which is a long trek for a kid. And after climbing on it a few times, we figured a way to get to the top. There's actually a walkway at the top that you could walk back and forth on, I guess, for maintenance and other things. So we finally figured out how to get up there. And we thought our mission was accomplished. Here's a picture of the old boathouse that was right there on the lagoon. When I was much younger, there were boat rentals. You can go out and rent a boat and go out and actually circumvent the lagoon, because at one time, it was just a one-sided lagoon, but they later carved a pathway around to create an island so that you could actually rowboat around the island and come back. It was never maintained. They stopped the rentals long before they demolished this thing. And eventually they demolished the little pier. And they put in what you see there on the right, which is like a nice little relaxing spot to sit on the benches, watch the wildlife go by. A nice fishing spot there too. So the site is still there. It's just not used as a boathouse anymore. This is one of the statues that was in the park from its early existence, the Lessing statue. And you can see it's still there right off Cottage Grove. These are the things that we knew as landmarks when we were going through the park. Now, my ideas of why I have learned to appreciate the park so much are vistas like this. There are a lot of long winding lanes and corridors. It just seems like a place that you would love to explore. It looks so large and magnificent that it was a 2 or 3 day journey just to explore any one part of the park. You know, we had to be home by a certain time, so we couldn't wander off too far. But these are the kind of things that I grew up with, and I cherish them now, because this larger grand space, it's got to be half a square mile, 372 acres I saw on Julia's earlier slide. Thanks, Julia, I'm still learning. These vistas are fantastic, and they're inviting. You can stroll down these lanes and sit and enjoy yourself, or have a respite, and probably use exactly as they were designed to be used by Olmsted when he designed the park. So a lot of the things that he put in place are still being used and just as functional as they were intended to be. They have these garden circles in many places, especially on the south half of the park. And there are some magnificent plantings that keep these things up. It's really a nice place to visit, and no more relaxing place you could imagine. And if you get there at off hours, like early in the morning, it's so peaceful that it's really enthralling. Here's a better picture of the garden circles. Of course, now you can see the University of Chicago looms in the background, but this space was here from the beginning. Here you can see some of the wildlife in the park. We still got a lot of geese. As a matter of fact, they don't leave the park now at all. They're year round. This may be the best slide for me. Well, this is maybe a better one. You can see some of the bridges, and that bridge goes to the island on the other side, the one that said they extended the lagoon around in order to let the rowboats circumvent it. For us, in the wintertime, we use the park year round. And we realized that in Chicago winters, it's a lot milder now, but then the lagoon would freeze over, and it would be frozen from December to March. And in January, we would drag our sleds across the lagoon and up onto the little island. We saw a place where there was a sort of a little ramp hill that led down onto the lagoon. And the beautiful part about that is that once you slid down the side of the hill there on your sled, once you hit the ice, you just took off. I mean, it was like a roller coaster ride for a sledder. So we really enjoyed that. Now I look back at it and realize the risk we were taking, and you know that I would never allow my child to do anything like that now. But at the time, we were pretty careful about it. We could see if the ice was cracking or anything like that. We weren't in much danger. But we found more ways to use the park than maybe Olmsted originally intended. And of course, that same lagoon is used today for fishing. And this is a regular thing. You'll see people out there fishing all through the summer. And I go out from time to time and fish. I seem to find myself too busy to sit for the proper amount of fishing time. You need to, put in 6 to 8 hours to really say you've done some fishing. But I will throw a rod in there from time to time myself. And the thing about it is that you find all kind of people out in the park fishing. All you have to do is have a rod. I've seen people go over next to the trees and they'll dig up earthworms and night crawlers right off the ground there in Washington Park, bait their hooks and start fishing. Washington Park has some hidden treasures. This is one that I didn't even realize until I went on a walk with Julia. This is actually a place where they fill some of the lagoon spaces, the smaller lagoon spaces, to keep them at proper water level. So this waterfall erupts from time to time. Sometimes it's on, sometimes it's off. But when it's on, it looks like you're outside of the country somewhere, or maybe up in Wyoming or something, watching a tributary race down toward the river. This is the Fountain of Tide, and some of its uses today. There were protests during the police protests here in Chicago as well. And there was a group of dancers that went out to have a dance recital right there in the Fountain of Tide. It was drained at the time, so it made a perfect backdrop. You can see some of the stuff there on the grounds, say their names, abolish ICE, which is here in Chicago. That's where they round up immigrants to deport. I was going to say export, to deport the immigrants. So there's a Black Lives Matter there as well. So this space, which was intended to be a gallery space, something that people would appreciate and awe, it still has many uses today. As you can see, it's a perfect backdrop for someone who wants to make a point. Here's another picture of that same Fountain of Tide, one of my favorite places. I think I've photographed this more than any one thing in the park. And from seeing our club members as well, they also go to the same location. It was restored too, because it's gotten in a pretty dilapidated condition. I think they restored it in the 80s, and it's been in pretty good shape ever since. I'm so glad they spent the money on that. Here's a picture of the Washington Park Pool Center. And as you can see, this is taken, I can't remember the year, but before Black folks or any other people moved down to the south part of the city, as far out from the loop. And it was pretty well segregated. Matter of fact, the park pools were some of the most segregated places in the city. We were just not allowed to go in there if there were white people in the pools. So luckily, by the time I got there in 1960, the pool was open to all of the public there, and I went to day swim all the time. One of the things I do remember about going to day swim in the pool is we all had to shower before we got into the pool, and they would do checks to see if you clean yourself thoroughly enough to go into the pool. And they would rub on the inside of your wrist or maybe your ankle to see if they could rub up some dead skin and send you back in there to wash again. So eventually I got the hint, and those particular places on my body, I would make sure I scrubbed them until there was no skin on them at all, and I would always pass going into the pool. You can see here, this is an Olympic-sized pool. It was one of the first Olympic-sized pools in the park district system. It was available, as a matter of fact, lifeguards came to Washington Park to train here. They also had other instructional stuff going on in the park because this pool was so magnificent, as well as having real competitions. You can see the grandstands here on the side. I like to show this picture because you can see them filling the pool. This is one of the pools. It's huge. It takes quite a while just to fill the pool. So because of that, the pools are never drained during the summer. They fill them in the spring and they stay full till the summer. So as I got older, I would in my early teens, mid-teens, we didn't go to regular day swim anymore. After day swim, they would have adult swim, like from 5 till 7 or 8, and then they would shut the pool down. So after dark, we go down there in our trunks or shorts, hop the fence, and go into late night swim. It was, I'm just thinking about the things that we did as children. And nowadays, that would be, highly unthought of. But it was a common practice, I learned from watching others do it. And it was a great time each time we did. Here's a picture of the refectory, which is the building just adjacent to the pool site there. And this is where all the locker rooms were and so forth. At one time, they had blocked off these colonnades to make separate rooms in there. Subsequently, they tore those out to rebuild the colonnades again. And you can see how grand the structure is there. So this is a place I would go to daily during the summer when I was, before I made 10 or 12, because I was going swimming almost every day. Now you can see the same place is used by homeless folks, as you would imagine. It's a shelter now. So you'll find homeless people who will set up camp there in the summer. Here's the group that we just saw. And I especially like this picture because they have no place else to be that can be safe and have what few belongings they have. But you can see they're sweeping the concrete there to keep their space nice. Economic conditions are no indication of the quality of life that a person wants to have around themselves. Here's a picture of the roundhouse. And this building was built as part of a stable and shed for the early police force, which was all horse-drawn carriages and things. And so in the wintertime, when they couldn't go out and make the rounds as easily because of the weather here, they would exercise the horses by sitting around in circles, for a couple hours inside this building to give them exercise. And this is how the roundhouse looks inside. It's been restored. It was in a terrible shape. It's been acquired as part of an extension of the DeSauva Museum. It almost doubles the space of the museum because this huge space here plus others associated with the roundhouse. And they have done some really nice exhibits in this space already. Currently, there's an exhibit by an artist called Nick Cave that's in there now. But this wooden dome here is really phenomenal. And anybody who likes to photograph structures will have a field day in here. And that's a picture of the wooden dome from below. And those windows up above serve a purpose because light enters the space from all directions. Here's a picture of the armory, the Army Armory in Washington Park. It was renamed as Richard Lee Jones Armory, I think in the early 2000s. But this is a place that we would pass in our treks around the park. And on one occasion, those little garage doors you see there, those doors were open when we went by. And growing up in the 60s, you had a huge reverence for authority. If you weren't told to be in a certain place, then you were forbidden. You didn't even attempt it. So we actually went in there to look around, and eventually one of the officers there asked us what we were doing and shuffled us out of there. But this is the interior of that building. So when we walk in there and we see all of these vehicles, it was very impressive. I have a sand pile in my backyard with green Army men and Army trucks, and we set up a little mass station in the sand pile. So when we got out here and saw half tracks for real, it was amazing to us as a child. So yeah, the present for me is my lifetime, my lifespan. And then this is a picture of the Grand Meadow as seen on a foggy night. And I love this picture. Julia likes it too. She insisted I put it in our presentation. And it really is great because it gives you that ethereal feel of just a grand expanse for you to be able to go out and explore and enjoy. So those are a lot of my recognitions of being in Washington Park and what it meant to me. And in hindsight, as an adult, it means even more. I'm currently a member of the Washington Park Camera Club. Like Julia said, we're one of the oldest predominantly Black camera clubs in the city. It's the only one that has been in existence since 1955. So I am very in love with this park. I have partial ownership.
Thank you, Duane. You've had a lot of comments of people really appreciating your reminiscences. One gentleman mentioned you kids will find a way to play no matter what. So I think that's very true. You had two questions very specific to your presentation. One is the pond or water that I don't know if it's a pond or it's not the lake.
We walked across the lagoon.
The lagoon, that's the word I'm looking for. Is it fish stocked, and what kind of fish?
Well, they have perch, catfish, and the lagoon is stocked every year because it is a fishing destination. And so knowing the park, I wouldn't have to know when they came in and stocked the lagoon again. The next day, you'd see dozens of people lined up there, pulling out big fish, 4 or 5 fish at a time. Right. So they do stock it, and it's still used. And there's other wildlife in there, frogs and turtles. And when it freezes over in the winter, they just go dormant. There are goldfish in a pond a little further north, but it's brimming with life.
And does the Olympic-sized pool still exist?
Yes, it does. As a matter of fact, they reworked the pool. It used to be 3 large pools there. There was I guess what you call a wading pool, where on the shallow end, it may have been 3 feet. In the deep end, it may have been 5 feet. And then this Olympic-sized pool, I think it's got the regular depth of 6 or 7 feet, and it's flat the whole way through. Then they had a diving pool with high dives and low dives on it. The high dive boards were regular, legal size high dive boards you see in the Olympics. And to see people go off of those things back then as a child was magnificent for us. Well, since then, they've changed the small wading pool into more of like a sprinkler kind of pool area where there's a lot of different places to spray water on you, but they took the pool part out. They cemented over the part of the diving pool, made it much more shallow. Now they have a huge water slide that feeds into there. But this Olympic-sized swimming pool that we were looking at earlier, it actually is exactly the same. It sits right there.
It's very interesting. One last question is Dawn is sharing that she grew up in Washington Park as well on the northeast side. And she's wondering, was the original plan to always have the north end kept green without water features and connecting trails?
It's called the Grand Meadow, and it serves another purpose. It probably serves that purpose that Olmsted said, well, this would be the most democratic place where people could meet and commingle among other cultures and other, how can I say, people with different economic statuses could meet there. And that space right now, as it is today, is if you go there on the weekends, you will find people playing cricket. Now, I've watched them, I've never learned to play, but they are full cricket teams set up in that big area. There's enough space in there for 2 full soccer fields. And often both soccer fields are running at the same time. Around the perimeter, toward the 55th Street side, or the south end of that Grand Meadow, are Little League baseball diamonds. And there are over 30 softball diamonds on the further northern end of that. And I played in one of the softball leagues, Sunday's Best Softball League. I played in that for 15 years. And it's really magnificent when you go there. And in order for that to have taken place, including all of the picnicking that's going on, all this is going on simultaneously. you have to have a grand area like that. So you're not interfering, you know, you're not hitting the ball into the soccer field and so forth. So it's really necessary. And we had a failed attempt to bring the Olympics here and of all the sites that the Olympics could have gone to, they chose Washington Park, that grand medal. They were going to build $100,000 stadium there, which would have ruined the whole thing, and supposedly leave behind a 20,000 rendition of that after they tore down what was going to be there for the Olympics. It would have been a big monstrosity, and taken for one event that doesn't even last 2 weeks, we would have lost all the usefulness of that grand space. So I was on a group called Black People Against Police Torture, and we actually went out and protested, put up signs and waited for the Olympic Committee to come by on their tours, and they never did. We were out there the day they were scheduled to come by. They never did. They repaved the whole thing and painted new lines on all the streets. They didn't show up. And then, of course, a couple of days later, we were out of the competition on the first round.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those stories. That's, you know, your childhood and your memories, as well as how the park is used today. And so to our audience, we've learned the history, we get a feel for how the park's used today, and it's time for our final speaker. So Duane, do you want to stop sharing your screen so our next speaker can share? So thank you. And we're going to bring up Patricia, who's been waiting patiently and experiencing the park in a new way. And our last speaker, she's going to tell us the future. So Patricia O'Donnell founded the Heritage Landscapes in 1987. It's an organization dedicated to the preservation, management, and celebration of valued park landscapes. Her firm has worked on plans and projects to revitalize over 50 Olmsted landscapes. And in 2015, the firm collaborated on a Jackson Park project that reasserts its historic landscape character while improving habitat, welcoming daily uses, and shaping a more maintainable landscape as a sustainable 21st century public park. So Patricia, won't you join us?
Certainly, thank you. And let me do the screen share. Oh.
I think you're not sharing your presentation.
I'm getting there. I have
Okay.
double screen, so it's a little
right.
tricky. How are we doing?
Perfect.
Okay. So thank you very much. It's my pleasure and privilege to present with you, and thanks to Julia and Duane and to the CAC. I begin by recognizing the Abenaki of the Lake Champlain Basin, on whose traditional lands I dwell, and also recognizing the tribes and bands of Indigenous throughout our country, offering respect for their traditions and recognition of their hardships borne over generations. The Olmsted legacy of Chicago parks are shared heritage of local and of national value. They've been spoken to by Julia and Duane as very local. They are complex and deeply layered, and they offer many benefits. I'd like to introduce the notion of planetary rights. I think it's time for us as people to work through the issues of human dominance and look at humanity as interrelated and dependent upon our planet. And planetary rights brings forward respect for the living earth, inclusive but not centered on humanity and human rights. This work of looking at important landscapes is about understanding all of their features. Often people think landscape architects look only at plants, but this is just a basic list of how we think about public space. We start with natural systems and hydrology, geomorphology, topography, the land uses, what the spatial and visual organization is. Many of the points Duane made were about beautiful space. visual relationships, the scenery of a park. Of course, vegetation is there, circulation routes. We experience the parks by walking down that path that Duane showed with the trees overhanging. Water systems and features are very important in Jackson Park, which is my principal topic, and I show you here an aerial view from the 1930s, which Julia showed in a slightly smaller form. In recent days, we tend also to incorporate buildings, mass and scale, and also consider atmospheric qualities of sound, sense, light, weather, and the seasons. So let me share with you a model I've been working on. I think we tend to think of biological and cultural diversity as very separate, but you see here they overlap. We have natural and human-shaped habitats, and the UN Convention on Biodiversity 2 years ago said that 75% of the planet had been deeply altered by humanity. Some of those places are vessels of biological diversity, and some are very meager habitats or even toxic sites. But humanity has had a huge impact. In terms of heritage, we think of the parts that are tangible and those that are intangible. And when we put the model together, we really see culture and nature as entangled and inseparable. So with that, let's just turn for a moment to this notion of sustainability. It includes environment, economy, and society. So we could say a park, its financial basis, and its community. And then if we look to how that shifts, we can speak about these as assets, not resources. Resources we can use and take for gain. Assets have inherent value. At Jackson Park, we were able to work on transforming heritage and habitat in order to make the park more resilient. It was a collaboration of the Chicago Park District, the Army Corps Chicago office, and Project 120, nonprofit that worked with us at that time. And we integrated the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Many of you may know about, others may not, that in 2015, even with our dysfunctional governance across the planet, the United Nations approved really visionary goals. So goal 3 is good health and well-being. Goal 10, reduce inequalities. Goal 11, sustainable cities and communities. Goal 13, climate action. Goal 14, life below water. And goal 15, life on land. All of these we were working to address in this work in Jackson Park. And to do so in an integrated design that was about social inclusion, historic preservation, and ecological restoration, all integrated together. So this is the whole 17 goals of the SDGs. I won't go through those, but if you look up UN Sustainable Development Goals or even UN SDGs, that will come up on your Google search. Julia's given us an overview, and we do have these key dates: the 73 Olmsted Walks original park design, the Olmsted Elliott World Columbian Exposition, and then the Olmsted Elliott work in 1895. What Julia didn't mention is it's the first brownfield because they had demolished over 200 buildings. They didn't know if they had soils. So it's the first soils plan I've ever seen in 1895. Then we started this Glypher project, the Great Lakes Fisheries and Ecology Restoration, Habitat and Historic Design work. And in 2022, the Obama Center started construction, and they started to change some of that work. So there is now mitigation underway. When we came to the park, the conditions were not great, quite degraded, pretty dysfunctional. These are both views on the wooded island. And the history of the park and this really incredible 1895 design really gave us good guidance. The monies were about ecology. The approval of the plan had to also be by the State Historic Preservation Office because this park is a landmark. The idea was to do a series of areas of improvement: planting, shoreline, access paths, overlooks, berms, and to work in different ecotones, different parts of the ecological environment: the lagoon, the fringe marsh, the island, the fringe meadow, and the savanna woodland. We were able in the project to uplift the community, make the park more environmentally resilient, work on cultural heritage preservation, make the park more maintainable because it was able to be reached and accessed along the haul roads we built, welcome people into the park and give them a sense of safety because they had better visual capture of the environment, and be more sustainable overall. And you see here, we've listed all of the elements, over a million new flowering forbs and grasses, along with 74 distinct plant communities. We also developed a series of overlooks. This is a planting plan on the left, and on the right, a place where we used sedges instead of grass. Grass is pretty environmentally vacant, and the sedge lawn with its spring ephemerals, it hosts a number of animals, insects, and so forth. The overall outcome is a welcoming, safer, more inclusive, and resilient lakeshore park. This image gives you on the top left a truncated lagoon that was filled in during the Cold War in recompense for taking part of the great meadow of this park and putting it behind a fence with Nike missile launchers in case of an attack. So we were able to extend it somewhat, make a much more scenic area of it, plant it, and make a path to access it. So this kind of transformation makes the park much more welcoming to people and much more engaging for people of all types, from the neighborhood and visitors. I was in the park last summer, and a family walked by, and the kids were looking at the erosion control detail, which was a core log, a coconut husk log, near this area. And I asked the kids if they knew what that was, and indicated that it was erosion control. And the mother said, "This is our happy place. This park is fantastic." So I end with saying cultural landscapes are a place for us to focus on and practice planetary rights. The earth is our concern. What our generations inherit is our communal platform. Parks are shared assets. And as citizens, professionals, and advocates, we need to aid heritage into the future. And we need to bring humility and skills to respect and honor the biocultural diversity of our cities and all of our places. Thank you.
I did not. I did not unmute myself. So why don't we invite everyone to join us, because I had a few questions just to ask everyone, and if people want to put their questions in the queue, we can gather some. I know Julia answered a few of the questions, but let me just ask a couple of questions, and one of them I actually see kind of something that I had wanted to ask you to mention. Now that we know that, of course, the Obama Presidential Center is well on its way of being constructed and has had a huge impact on Jackson Park, what do you feel are the benefits and drawbacks of the center to the community? That could be, everybody can answer. or one of you?
I'd like to start with some of the mitigation because I know some of the details. We were asked to help the Chicago Park District to work through the mitigation. They're adding a lane to Lakeshore Drive, but they're taking away Cornell Drive and turning it into a path. So the good news there is that Cornell Drive created a lot of traffic in the middle of the park, and taking Cornell Drive away gives a nice walkway at one side, the west side along the wooded aisle. The bad news is that they've damaged some of the work that we did with the Gliffer project. That was federally funded. Somebody has asked here where the funding came from. So the Great Lakes Fund for the restoration of fisheries and habitat is the source there. So they are going to continue some of that work and add the southernmost part of the boat harbor. So those are the good outcomes for the park. More traffic on Lakeshore Drive, not such a great outcome, but the traffic has to go somewhere. I'm sure others have a viewpoint as well.
Duane?
Of all of the open spaces in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, they did not need to build anything inside of a park. So that's just a personal opinion. The two sites that were competing at the end was a Washington Park site, and this site was ultimately chosen. And if you go through the area, you will find spaces just adjacent to the park that are plenty large enough to, and still have the park as a backdrop if they wanted to. This idea of placing things right in the parks over and over again, it's got to stop. What's the use in having these grand spaces if they're going to be chewed away by motorists trying to get to a tourist location?
See any benefit, Julia?
So what I'd like to add is that, so I, of course, have great admiration for President Obama, but I've heard him twice now say that he wants to give to the South Siders what people on the North Side have because of parks like Lincoln Park. And so if I just ever had the opportunity, I would have just loved to have given him a tour of Jackson Park and tell him that I'm a North Sider. I'm a North Sider. I go all the way to the South Side to use Jackson Park. I would, and Duane knows this. He knows how much time I spend in Jackson Park and Washington Park. I would want to have Jackson Park 1,000 times more than I would ever want to have Lincoln Park. And I don't mean to diss Lincoln Park, but and again, I've had this conversation with Duane. In Washington Park and Jackson Park, you go there and there's a sense of discovery, and there's a sense of like you just have this feeling that you kind of lose yourself in nature, but it's in like an organized nature, not like a messy wildlife kind of nature. There's something so special about those places. But now, you know, this idea that a good park has to have all these bells and whistles like Maggie Daley Park or something, I think it misses the point. And so I think it's really sad that to add this like major thing to a existing park and not understand the asset, thank you, Patricia, that you already have.
Yeah.
You know, it is so interesting. I know we've had this conversation in our office of that, what makes a good, or, you know, Duane brought us so many good memories of how children play and find a place to play in whatever situation they're in. And now oftentimes parks need to end up being attractions, and they don't just get to be where people can have their imagination, where they can relax, where, you know, all the different things. So that's very good. You're not alone in your opinion from some of the comments we're seeing, Duane. But let's turn things over to another area. So why do you think it's important to preserve our Olmsted landscapes? I'm sure each of you probably have different reasons that you would think of an answer for that. Julia, maybe you, Duane, go right ahead.
You know, what's amazing to me is that over a century ago, this thing was laid out with a purpose of how it could be used by people. And it's still serving its purpose today. I mean, not hardly anything else I've seen built ever can last that long and still be that important to its people and still have its original purpose being done.
Yeah, I think that there's something so special about many of these Olmsted landscapes that they've sort of like captured the American imagination of what a great park should be. So, when we were talking before about, saving parks for the future and how important it is for climate change and sustainability, and all of that is so true, but there's something so special about many of the Olmsted designs, especially these two parks, in Chicago. They're just such tremendous, they're living works of art. And I just think it would be such a shame for future generations not to have that.
Well, I would just like to say that I think the Olmsted legacy is enduring because it's correct. Basically offering nature in the city to people, welcoming everyone. That's the baseline. So when we let our cities mitigate or mute down the value of those parks, we need to speak up. So I've put in the chat a note that says, as this work continues in Jackson Park, there's a problem in this park. We had a great meadow, the same kind of great meadow that Duane was talking about. It's mostly behind a fence and a parking lot now.
Mm.
So when we worked on this park, we said, look, guys, you really got to go from the Music Grove all the way down to Hayes Drive and bring that large meadow back and get rid of the fence and get rid of the golf and, have the meadow. Ann Lee has just put in the chat that she visited Delaware Park in Buffalo, and even though there is a highway that runs through it, the meadow remains with a gorgeous 200-year-old oak spreading its beautiful open head in the middle of that meadow. It's traditionally been used by a golf course, but the golf is somewhat benign. It doesn't always happen, and you can still walk in the meadow. If we always let everybody play on that great space in Washington Park, we don't give people the opportunity to just take a walk in that meadow. Right. I think we have to have like a no game time as well as a game time. So like that both
day swim and the night swim.
Yeah, the thing that's great about parks is that they are flexible and they can have multiple uses. But the minute we put a fence around that little league field, it only has one use.
Right. So true.
So we have to make sure that we keep the multiple uses of park space.
And it's sort of, I think, a little disappointing that the Park District is still talking about combining the Jackson Park golf course with the South Shore Cultural Center golf course, and just devoting more space to golf. And I don't know what the numbers are.
Use. It's not the right direction to go in.
I just don't think there's that many, but there's that many people that golf. It's nice that it retains a lot of, but as you're saying, Patricia, it's for a very selective small group.
So we have a question that kind of relates with this. So from Scott, how can we landmark and protect our important parks so they do not get permanently altered? In Buena Park, we're working on trying to landmark and protect the Peace Garden at the east end of Buena Avenue. Any advice on protecting these important treasures?
So the only landmarks protection that actually really protects, because I spent quite a bit of my career designating these parks to the National Register of Historic Places, and it does create a dialogue, which we call Section 106, which is what Patricia is referring to, that there's various mitigations, but it's not very strong. And so the Chicago Landmarks Ordinance is the only really strong protection that we have. And there are only a small number of landscapes that have been designated. And honestly, at this point in our kind of political climate, the Chicago Landmarks Commission isn't designating a lot. But I have been working with the Promontory Point Conservancy, and they are talking to the mayor and the alderman about designating Promontory Point as a Chicago landmark. So it's like a lot of advocacy to try to get local designation, because that's the only legal protection that's really strong.
Okay. So we're kind of nearing our end. So I'll just finish up with one last question to all of you. You know, this whole year we've really been talking about Frederick Law Olmsted. What do you think is the enduring lesson that we take away?
Well, let me say something, because I saw something else in the thing about where is there a way to identify the trees and things like that. If you look at it from an educational point of view for a child growing up, we had a project where we had to collect leaves as a child and bring them in a notebook and identify them all, 30, 40 leaves we expected to do. I could have never done that without that park there. And if you go over to Wooded Island and Jackson Park, they actually have a flyer, a piece of paper there that has a map and identifies every tree on the Wooded Island. So if you wanted to educate yourself, you could. Fred Lott and a few other people from the Washington Park Camera Club go out regularly to observe the birds, the migrating birds that come through in the spring. And there's got to be 30, 40 different species that come through the park. If you don't have a train now, you may never see them. But if you go on tours, I mean, it's just so much there, an abundance of education that can be brought to people because of the space. And I think that should never be taken away.
Okay. Thank you.
And that was actually an important piece of the Gliffer project, because native plants for cover and food are needed in each park, because you are on a flyway. I mean, the birds come down through Canada, across Lake Michigan, along the Lake Michigan shore, and continue south to their winter homes. And the kind of cover that the native plants that we were able to put in only a portion of the park, about 100 acres, really increase the bird populace. And one of the photos that was taken after this was a pack of bird watchers, all with their binoculars on. So I think that's an important aspect. And that's an update from Olmsted, because while Olmsted Park's meadows were intended as meadows, over time they became mown lawn. So instead of the kind of rich ecology that a short meadow with native wildflowers and grasses can offer, they became more sterile as large patches of lawn. Even golf courses can have edges of rough, which I've seen the original St. Andrews course in Scotland above, in the north of Scotland. And it's really interesting. It's a different kind of landscape than you often see in a golf course. So, we all need to think about how are we handling the rest of the forms of life? Can they find a place here, not only us?
One thing I'd like to kind of add, especially with having Patricia here, is that, for years I would give walking tours. I still love to give walking tours, but for years I give walking tours of Jackson Park, and always love to go across the island because it's a great way to do it. But it was so overgrown. There was so much volunteer, shrubs and thicket that had taken over, that I would just have to we do sort of pushing through these branches, trying to get to a spot where you could see the water. And I would say to people, try to imagine these beautiful scenery, with the branches framing like a window with a view of the water. And Patricia's work included restoring these overlooks. And so when you walk across the island, and it's really fun to do the whole loop around the entire island, there are these just beautiful views. So in addition to that, yes, there's more wildlife. I mean, it was such a coup having the opportunity to bring in an expert who really knows about Olmsted, and the botanist for the Army Corps didn't know what hit him when he met Patricia O'Donnell, because she knows her plants so well. And I just remember like the initial, like, you know, like he looked like a deer in the headlights, because they were just used to like just shooting you down because you have to have all these plants. And then she'd be like, oh no, we could use the blah, 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 you know. And
You
so
got to know
anyway,
your botanical Latin if you talk to ecologists.
Right.
but just for those of us who don't know all of it, but just, you know, kind of understand the idea of what, you know, what it was meant to be, and to be able to have that experience again, it's just so fantastic. So I hope that once the Obama Presidential Center obviously is going to bring in loads and loads and loads of people, that it doesn't get trampled and destroyed. And already somebody commented that there's already been quite a bit of vandalism in the Japanese garden. There was a fire to the little moon bridge. And so I hope somehow that we can collectively kind of let our you know, city officials know that this is something that we all value, whether we're going to argue about golf courses or not. We all are here because we love parks and we love you know, beautifully designed landscapes.
So I put a note in the chat just to say that the thicket that Julia was talking about, the idea in Jackson Park, they told us from the beginning, we will manage this park, these new species that you're planting, with controlled burning, because we don't have enough people and we have to burn it. So the good news about burning is it's done in small patches and it's controlled, and it burns out the invasive plants that we don't want, that would create the thicket that Julia was talking about. Because the woodlands, if they're healthy, have an understory that you can see into, and meadows, if they're healthy, are below waist height. So the idea is to suppress what I call the bully plants, the badly behaved plants that come from other places and don't act nicely and push out the natives. So I think that in any landscape, Chicago is very good at making beautiful landscapes. They're not necessarily good at making maintainable landscapes. So in these new projects you're talking about on the lakefront and so forth, as you review, as members of the public, you review these designs, ask the maintenance question, find out who's going to take care of these, because it's so easy. It's so much more easy. I don't say it's easy, but it's so much more easy to get the money to build something than it is to take care of it. And frankly, in our society, we do not value caretakers. That's another thing that we really have to change. We have to change our value system to get away from the stars and the big money and say, look, if you're living a good life and you're taking care of your place, you're a star as a caretaker.
Right. Thank you, Patricia. All right, our time is up. Who's going to have the last word of telling us what the legacy of Olmsted is?
I mean, that was just such a great thing what Patricia just said. That is completely resonating on every aspect of life and society, and everything that we're dealing with today. Is that you're absolutely right. We need to take care of what we have before, you know.
And
so I'm going to let her have the final word.
Yeah, I mean, uplifting caretakers is something we should do every day.
Right. And not even just
Gratitude
for
those who
parks.
take care of our assets.
Right. Well, I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank our audience for joining us. Just want to mention once again, if you want to get the new Chicago Architecture Center app, on that app, we have a self-guided tour that you can do. That is the, I wrote it down so I'd have it. It's Olmsted South Park at 150, and you'll hear Julia Bachrach. We have audio from Julia on this tour. So I want to encourage you to do that. I know I saw several people saying that before it gets too cold, we're going over to Washington Park. So take your self-guided tour and experiencing it. And someone also just put, that was Michael Wood putting that down for us about the tour. So thank you. The link to the app is, to get the app is in the chat. So thank you all. I appreciate your time and thank you for an enjoyable session from all 3 points of view, from the history, the present, and the future.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.